I'm James Rossi, and I'm here today to talk to you about Data versus Democracy, a book by Dr. Kris Shaffer. In this relatively short read, Dr. Shaffer attempts to lay out how big data and the algorithms utilized by big data engines such as Facebook influence the way we as users think and ultimately pose a credible and direct threat to the democratic process. I like the way that Dr. Shaffer laid this book out in two parts. In the first part, he talks about the human cognitive function, or how the brain works. He talks about attention triggers and priming. Then he uses this information and segues into real-life examples of how big data played a part in pivotal events in recent history. He starts off by talking about the Michael Brown shooting in Missouri, where Twitter was the primary tool utilized by protesters in light of law enforcement attempting to keep mainstream media in the dark. Then he goes to the polar opposite and talks about Gamergate with Zoe Quinn, how this independent programmer was found herself in the middle of groupthink and a mob rules mentality, which left her fearing for her life and the safety of her loved ones. He takes all this information and neatly bundles it into the political arena, first touching on the 2016 election and the Russian intervention via social media in influencing voter turnout, which some believe ultimately led to President Donald J. Trump inheriting the presidency. He goes on to talk about other global examples of how propaganda and misinformation on the internet influence the outcomes. And that's his basis for the threat. Here's where I think the piece falls short. First off, I don't think the author gave enough credibility to the existence of fake news prior to the advent of the internet. There are documented cases of fake news going back as far as 1475. Secondly, I think that the vehicle is completely wrong. Dr. Shaffer, by his own admission on page 6, says, on top of that, most of us received an education that was designed during and for an internet-free world. What I think he overlooks is that the age group of 18 to 29 has been found to read less and less progressively year over year. And when you couple that with 52 to 55% of eligible voters in the 2020 election, ages 18 to 29, turned out to vote, I almost feel like the written word is the wrong vehicle to spread the message. Lastly, he goes toward his conclusion with the concept that ultimately politicians and the big data engines, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, are ultimately responsible for filtering our information. And in my opinion, I believe that is the direct and credible threat to the democratic process. Democracy at its very heart is the ability to choose, the ability of a group to come together with one voice, for each to be able to express their own opinion. To put that responsibility of filtering and making informed decisions in the laps of the likes of Facebook and Twitter, you're asking for those companies to go against the very fabric in which they were designed. The data is designed to influence us, to inform us, and in some cases it's used in the wrong way. But this is a $61 billion industry as of 2020. And to ask them to not provide content that ultimately engages the user is counterintuitive to their business model. Where I think that Dr. Shaffer would have been better served is to highlight in his conclusion the fact that ultimately the democratic process is the embodiment of the human spirit's ability to choose, and that we are therefore ultimately responsible for making decisions as to what we will believe and what we won't believe. Yes, there is something to be said for fact checking. That's a real hot button in 2020 and 2021. But we have to be responsible as users for deciding what it is that we choose to believe and what we choose to think.